Minato versus Tobirama is one of the most hotly debated topics in the Naruto community, and it's really no surprise. These two powerhouses are narratively tied together in a ton of ways. Both the second and fourth Hokage were hailed as the fastest in particular points of history, possessed the physics-defying Flying Raijin, and even died to protect the village. But despite solid arguments existing on both sides for years and numerous debates on this topic having been done, the question still remains. In a battle to the death, which of these two geniuses would prevail over the other? That's exactly what we'll be covering in this video. I'll be analyzing their feats and statements and doing a deep dive breakdown of the arguments for both sides to showcase why this might be closer than a lot of people think, while also being a bit more straightforward than others might believe. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down why Minato versus Tobirama is weird. Just as a heads up, this video will be essentially a how-to argue video where I cover the arguments for both sides, but I'll also give you my personal opinion at the end. So if you're looking to learn arguments to use for either side, or just want to learn more about the more niche sides of these guys scaling, this video is for you, and will do exactly that. I think the best way to do this, though, is to begin with Tobirama, since a lot of people seem to see me as a Minato guy, and also the arguments for him are a bit less nuanced than Minato's, so they're a bit easier to analyze. First, the most important thing to say here is that most people agree these two have win cons over one another, so as long as they can tag one another, they can win. They should both be able to do damage to one another with kunai, as that's consistent with characters on the same tier throughout the series, with even Kid Naruto, who's significantly below Zabuza, threatening him with a kunai. We see Mizuki piercing Iruka with a kunai, both of them being Chunin, so we see this consistently, and they both have jutsu that should also be able to take down the other, so what it really comes down to is speed, which is pretty fitting for these two. So what I'll be doing here is covering the most relevant speed arguments for these two in depth, and honestly analyzing which ones work and don't work, and which ones I think are the best to use for scaling. For Tobirama, the speed scaling arguments come down to three main scales: Juubito, KCM Minato, and Madara. Let's start with the Juubito scale. Essentially, this scaling goes: Tobirama was able to react to, tag, and place paper bombs on Juubito. Therefore, since he can perform this feat while KCM Minato gets fodderized by Juubito, he has better scaling than Minato. The highest end scale for this involves Tobirama manually planting the 4 paper bombs we see on Juubito one at a time, which would effectively be a quadruple perception blitz, but this is dumb for a few reasons. Number one, it would be inconsistent with his other scaling. Number two, if he did this, he also would have jumped in front of Juubito after planting them in order to get hit with the TSO charge, which makes no sense as it's disadvantageous. And number three, we have good reason to believe that there are other methods Tobirama was more likely to use. In Tobirama's birthday column, we find out that the way he used Edo Tensei while he was alive was planting paper bombs on his Edos and sending them behind enemy lines to blow up his adversaries. Therefore, since he himself is an Edo and they traveled a great distance to get there, it's likely that he planted these bombs in himself, which would allow for the bombs that are stuck to Juubito to get there without any extra shenanigans. We actually have evidence of this with him pulling the tandem paper bombs out of his chest right after this, and this kind of dispels the counter that people usually use saying the TSO charge would have destroyed the paper bombs as well, as they're still literally inside of his chest. So if the tandem paper bombs were there, it's not really an issue for the regular ones to be there. Plus, we do see with the wind from his rush that some of the paper rubbles that Tobirama is made of follow him, much like trash kind of follows a car as it drives past it at a high rate of speed. So it's perfectly reasonable for these to have been placed on him from either the charge itself or the wind off of the rush. It's also possible that he just used the same hand motion he used to tag Juubito under the armpit to throw the paper bombs on Juubito as he was rushing at him. So regardless of which way you go, both of those possibilities have far more consistent basis backing them than the idea that Tobirama perception blitzed Juubito 4 times over and then jumped back in his way for no apparent reason. What this feat does do for Tobirama, though, is still impressive. He is, in fact, capable of physically tagging Juubito as he runs through him, which means that at least at a certain distance, he's capable of somewhat physically reacting to him. My buddy Acolyte pixel calced this and determined that Juubito covered roughly 23.5 feet from himself to Tobirama in the amount of time it took for Tobirama to place his FTG seal on Juubito and place the bombs. If we're super generous, we can say that Tobirama moved his arm a maximum of like 2 feet feet, but it's probably less than that if we're being fair. If we do decide to be generous and assume that he moved his arm 2 whole feet, that would get Juubito here to 11.75 times faster than Tobirama. This actually isn't bad, but it doesn't really get us anywhere in regards to Minato, as it doesn't get him relative to Juubito at close quarters combat range, and therefore has no real connective tissue to Minato here. What I mean by this is that there's no way you could say that Juubito is over 11.7 times faster than Minato, especially not the unstable version of Juubito that Tobirama is reacting to here, as opposed to the stabilized version that Minato gets his arm cut off by. That said, this is probably the worst of the 3 primary scales used for him, despite this being the most popular. The second scale that a lot of people use for Tobirama is by using KCM Minato. Essentially, the argument goes like this. Tobirama outperforms and outreacts KCM Minato, and KCM is an amp, so he should be above base Minato. The main thing used for this is Tobirama saving Minato, Naruto, and Sasuke from Juubito's explosive TSO. Basically, Minato gets his arm cut off by stabilized Juubito, and the TSO gets stuck to him, set to detonate, and in the time it takes for Minato to reach his arm from his hip across his body to the TSO on his opposite shoulder, Tobirama's shadow clone is able to seemingly body flicker over to them and grab the orb. This would mean that Tobirama's body flicker would exceed Minato's standard combat speed in KCM, which should put his body flicker far above what it would take to blitz Minato with the body flicker and unalive him. This would be the nail in the coffin, if not for 2 really big issues here. Number 1, body flicker just goes above standard combat speed to begin with, so since Minato is not looking at him, it doesn't really do anything here, as we can't say that this body flicker speed would be above Minato's body flicker speed. And second, Minato is mentally nerfed. At this point, it's incredibly clear that Minato is in a stupor, as stated by Data Book 4. First, let's take a look at the infamous stupor statement in question. It reads, "His beloved disciple's appearance was terribly changed beyond all recognition, with his own sin being unable to see the true face behind the mask on that day. What invigorated Minato from his stupor was his own son Naruto, who had grown into a first-rate shinobi. Father and son joined fists and opposed the threat to the shinobi world." The kanji here for stupor is soshin, which means to be dazed as if your soul had left your body, and is commonly used in regards to describing the emotional state of someone grieving a loved one's death at a funeral. And that is why this argument falls apart. If you've ever played video games or tried to complete really any task while someone is yammering at you, your performance drops, even if only a little. So if you've ever experienced the heartache of losing a loved one, you know the absent-minded state of intense grief is far more severe in regards to your performance than simply having someone talk to you while trying to perform a task, which would make it more difficult to complete the task at hand due to your reactions being slowed and dulled. That's what's going on with Minato here. His reaction time had slowed, so he was late realizing the TSO was on him and acted late. If you're arguing for Tobirama here though, you'd say, sure, he can be mentally nerfed, but A, he's in KCM, so I doubt the mental nerf from grief would overwhelm that amp, and B, how do we know that the stupor had already started at this point as opposed to later? These would be solid rebuttals, but they rely heavily on fairly weak skepticism, which I'd argue can be taken care of easily with simple rationalization. For the first part, you'd have to establish why KCM offers a mental reaction amp at all, as mental reaction speed is what we're talking about here. You'd then have to explain to what degree this perception amp affects the user, and then explain why a mental nerf like this is unlikely to have a greater effect than said KCM reaction amp. There are reasons to believe that KCM doesn't actually amp reaction speeds at all, or at least not to the same level that it amps physical speed, but that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is determining the degree of mental amplification, if it exists, in comparison to the degree of effect from the mental nerf. This is why it's a weird topic. You have to get pretty granular with your arguments as a Tobirama guy and as a Minato guy. Now, you can get these points through so long as the person you're talking to doesn't also have the ability to get just as granular with basic skepticism. The second part, though, is a little bit more difficult if you're arguing for Minato, but only because it requires some narrative analysis skill. Due to this, as a Tobirama fan, the "how do we know that the stupor had already started" argument will be really strong against most people. You'd also be able to make your argument more steady by pointing to the birthday column column entry on this and saying, well, since it says he was struck by guilt while Juubito was talking to him later on during the fight, and to be struck by something, guilt in this case, implies that the guilt started in that moment, you'd have a basis from which you can argue that Minato was not in the stupor at this point in time because the struck by language. However, this is another reason why the discussion is weird. The best way to counter this argument is to look at the kanji. Upon analyzing it, what you'll find is that it doesn't say he's struck by guilt in that moment, but rather overcome by guilt. This would simply mean that the guilt got worse than what it was previously, not that it necessarily hit him all at once in that exact moment, which just kills that argument. So then, let's take an honest look at what we know about the stupor so we can see if we can establish when exactly it should begin. First, we know the stupor was caused by the guilt from not recognizing Obito was the face behind the mask. This is openly stated as the perceived sin he feels guilt for in Data Book 4. Second, we know that he realizes that Obito was Obito upon slicing him, as we get this indication from his own mental flashbacks during that moment along with his inner dialogue. Third, he's fully overcome by guilt when Juubito is trashing him later on, and finally, we know the stupor stops once he and Naruto share words and bump fists. Based on these things, the argument from the Minato side would be, premise 1, Minato's stupor is caused by guilt from not recognizing that the face behind the mask was Obito. Premise 2, he realizes it was Obito and therefore likely realizes his failure upon slicing him, which would likely lead to the feeling of guilt. Conclusion, the stupor likely began when he sliced Obito. Fairly simple, but a bit of a pain in the ass to get into on both sides, as again, you do have to get into the minutia and pretty granular. However, I don't think it's a great way to go if you're arguing for Tobirama, as the Minato side is only required to show why Minato is mentally nerfed here, which would invalidate any connective scaling unless the Tobirama side is able to quantify the absent nerfs, which is an impossible burden. This is especially true when you consider the argument 6 just put out, showcasing that this mentally nerfed Minato and Tobirama are displayed to have the same mental reaction speed as indicated by these panels, which is all that's necessary for Minato to FTG out of the way of any of Tobirama's attacks. So if you don't think KCM amps perception, or at least not significantly, you'd actually be able to use this argument to show that Minato's standard reactions should be above Tobirama's if he's not mentally nerfed. This is the best argument for Tobirama in my humble opinion. The argument goes like this. Tobirama is stated by Madara to have boasted the best speed of any shinobi, which should apply to Madara, so he should be faster than Madara. This can be argued effectively by a good debater to get Tobirama over a live Madara, which would be another scaling point that makes the Minato side feel the need to get Minato over Madara as well, which does take some work. The problem here though is there are a few really glaring issues. First, the statement just says Tobirama once boasted the greatest speed of any shinobi, so it doesn't even necessarily apply to Madara's time. However, I think the argument that it should is fairly simple, since Madara making that statement to Tobirama, with Tobirama not knowing that he didn't actually die when he was supposed to have, would indicate that what's being communicated here is that Madara is referencing a time when both of them were active. The next question though is, what does it mean when he's called the fastest? Does that indicate that he's the fastest in terms of physical speed, or does it include FTG? Well, I think you could argue it's in terms of physical speed, but it's unlikely to be excluding FTG for one big reason. FTG is specifically called a speed technique and is generally included when Minato and Tobirama are called fast. A good example of this is when Obito calls Minato fast upon escaping his Kamui warping with FTG. Even the FTG databook statement refers to it as a speed technique and describes it as swiftness that surpasses body flicker. Minato gained the nickname Yellow Flash due to his proficiency with FTG, and FTG is even called Tobirama's calling card from the Warring States era. Essentially, there are a lot of statements calling FTG fast or describing it as having speed or being a speed technique, and it's used in creating the reputations for these two being the fastest in the world at different points in time. So it's reasonable to assume that the statement in question is also including this ultimate speed technique and not just physical speed. This would mean that there's no way to connect his movement or striking speed to Madara and thus Minato in any meaningful way using this argument. The second big issue is that even if you accept that it is in reference to physical combat speed, the fact fact that Hashirama is stated to be peerless, and the only person who could ever challenge him is Madara, and the only person who could ever challenge Madara is Hashirama, makes it fairly clear that whatever speed advantage he may have had has to be able to be countered by Madara and Hashirama's other abilities, such as Wood Style or Susanoo. This means he can't be perception blitzing them or anything, so even after steel manning the first part of this argument, Tobirama would just be ambiguously above them in combat speed, but not fast enough to be blitzing them. However, if you can get the Minato side to agree to it being in reference to physical speed or combat speed, you can then use skepticism to minimize Minato's scaling and possibly build a scaling chain based off of this to get Tobirama over Minato, so long as you get around the Stupor. That's kind of the point though. It's a weird topic because there's no real connective tissue between the two and any of this Tobirama over Minato scaling outside of the KCM Minato stuff. In other words, without countering the Stupor argument, there isn't any scaling offered here that definitively puts Tobirama above Minato or even creates likelihood for it, but rather places him ambiguously around the level of other characters who have no real connective scaling to Minato. This means that even if Tobirama is ambiguously above Madara in combat speed or 1/11th the speed of Juubito, it doesn't actually connect to Minato in any way, so those scaling points can be true while Minato can still possibly be above that level. So due to this disconnected scaling, the Tobirama side relies on establishing a floor for Tobirama at one of these ambiguous points, and then establishing a ceiling for Minato at a lower point. Now that we've covered Tobirama's arguments, let's dive into Minato's, starting with one of the more infamous ones, Minato's superior body flicker. Basically, this argument goes like this. Minato is faster than Tobirama using body flicker since he arrived to the battlefield before him, and Tobirama states Minato's body flicker is even better than his own. This one seems pretty straightforward, but there's actually a lot more here than meets the eye. Casual fans, buckle up. This has been going on in the community for a while, so you're about to find out a whole bunch of stuff you probably didn't know. First, the kanji here for body flicker, Shunshin, is the kanji for body flicker, but it's also used a few times to describe FTG. We see this most notably when Tobirama, the inventor of the technique, uses Shunshin when referencing FTG. We also see this from Obito when he calls Minato's FTG markings Shunshin markings. This is because Shunshin is being used as both an umbrella term for speed techniques in general, as well as the specific name for the most commonly used speed technique in Naruto. Basically, think of Shunshin as speed technique. Body flicker is what people refer to most of the time, but FTG is also a type of Shunshin. So if you're arguing for Tobirama, you'd say something like, this is more likely in reference to FTG since we see him arrive to the battlefield officially with his FTG to the marked kunai. In fact, it's possible that he teleported to B in order to teleport away the Bijou Bomb, as B should have a marking on him, so he should be able to use FTG to get there. There are a couple of rebuttals to this, but the best one in my opinion is that the birthday column for Minato says that he arrived to the battlefield using body flicker, and they do delineate between FTG and body flicker incredibly consistently. We see that when FTG is mentioned, it's consistently called FTG, with the writers even taking the opportunity to specify that Tobirama's statement shown earlier was in reference to FTG. The one time it's referred to as teleportation jutsu, what Viz translates Shunshin to, the kanji actually translates to spatio-temporal jutsu, as opposed to body flicker. Also, this argument presupposes that he knew he had markings on the battlefield, which we just can't confirm. He doesn't teleport to Obito, who he should know would have a marking since they fought, as well as Naruto, who he should have put a marking on at birth, as Kurama says that there was one in his FTG seal. So since he doesn't make use of the other markings on the battlefield, and this delineation exists consistently in the birthday columns, it's likely that it was in reference to body flicker as opposed to FTG. As to why he didn't teleport to Naruto or Obito, I don't know, maybe he didn't think about it, but he just didn't use those FTG markings, so we can't say that he would use the one on B if he's not using the ones for everyone else. So since it is most likely in reference to body flicker based on this, that would mean that Minato's body flicker is likely to be faster than Tobirama's. Some will try to counter this by saying something along the lines of, well, maybe Minato got to the battlefield faster because he's better at using it over long distances, but he could be slower at close range. This is bad for two reasons. Number one, Tobirama makes a general statement about body flicker, as opposed to specifying that Minato is better over long distances or has better stamina or something with it. So it's likely to be an overall general statement, as that's how it's made, as opposed to a refined one to a single application of the body flicker. Number 2, if Tobirama is faster using body flicker over some shorter range, but slower over a long distance, the implication there would be that he's worse at keeping it active or outputting the chakra necessary for the body flicker over a long distance, but this doesn't make a lot of sense unless you argue that he just didn't have the chakra or stamina to maintain it. If that were the case, we would likely see signs of this, like fatigue or something like that. Since we don't see any signs of this fatigue or sweating or anything, it's unlikely that this is the case. I mean, think about it. The body flicker is a D-rank jutsu, one that a genin can master. Tobirama is a senju, renowned for having strong stamina and bodily chakra. Chakra is so powerful that Minato actually reacts to it whenever he's flexing on Sasuke. What you'd be saying from the Tobirama side is that either A, Minato has better stamina and or chakra and Tobirama just ran out of juice despite the lack of evidence that that would be consistent with, or B, Minato is more efficient with his stamina or chakra and Tobirama ran out of juice despite the lack of evidence that would be consistent with that. Thus, it's simply more likely to be the case that Minato's body flicker is just faster than Tobirama's. From there, if you're arguing for Tobirama, you'd then go on to ask, even if he is faster with body flicker, to what degree is Minato's body flicker faster? Which is a valid question and is truly impossible to answer. However, having a faster body flicker by any degree would increase the likelihood of winning a body flicker clash, and Minato does use body flicker to open battles according to B. This statement comes from the KCM training arc when Naruto uses body flicker to attack Kisame, and B says, "Is that teleportation jutsu," meaning body flicker, "first to bat quite a smash just like the yellow flash?" Upon translating this though, what it actually says is, "Was that body flicker a preemptive attack? It's just like the yellow flash." What this means is that Minato opens fights with preemptive body flicker attacks, which would lead to a likelihood of him defeating Tobirama in a clash off rip if he's faster to any degree. The problem with this though is that if the speed gap can't be established to be wide enough for Minato to blitz Tobirama, or at least almost blitz him, which is admittedly an impossible burden, then Tobirama should reasonably be able to just parry or block the attack and be just fine. So it doesn't necessarily lead to a W for Minato, but it certainly adds likelihood for him winning the fight outside of additional arguments for Tobirama's arsenal. I would go over the Might Guy stuff, but it's not really a physical speed thing, it's just a reaction speed thing, and Six's argument about reaction speed already gets Minato's reaction speeds to or above Tobirama's, so does them being able to use the reciprocal round robin, so that's not really an important one here. The one I want to take us to is Minato over Kurama. Basically, the argument goes like this. Minato outspeeds Kurama using body flicker during the Ninetales attack, so he's above Kurama using body flicker. Kurama is relative to the Wood Golem, which is relative to Madara's Susanoo, which is above Madara, due to the Susanoo consistently being faster than the user. Therefore, since the fastest of all shinobi Tobirama statement isn't necessarily in reference to his physical combat speed, but rather FTG, and therefore we can't get Tobirama definitively above Madara, Minato having this speed scale gives him the better speed assertion, making it more likely for him to win. I actually think this is fairly sound, but there are a couple of hurdles you have to clear if you're on the Minato side here. First, the initial outspeed I pointed to must be pixel calc to use. So thankfully, I've done that. This shows that Minato almost definitely outspeeds Kurama here by a decent margin. I have the numbers on screen for you right here that shows you the entire calculation, and that would lock this one in and allow for the scale to go through and showcase that he is just faster than Kurama. You can argue the validity of the pixel calc as a Tobirama defender, but then you'd have to argue the validity of every pixel calc and the reference for distance in the entire series, so good luck. So this one actually works quite well. It's just weird because you have to get into the weeds a little bit. The second one carries a little bit of baggage too, since Minato appears to be able to blitz Kurama across the battlefield with body flicker, but it's unclear if Kurama is even paying attention to him, and it's unclear how quickly he can charge a Bijou Bomb to the size that we see him charge it to. Some people will try to claim that Minato used FTG be here, but that doesn't make any sense, as he doesn't have any seals on Kurama, and he's unlikely to have seals on the surrounding area, as he's only really shown to leave them on battlefields or places that are shown to be important to him, such as his home or his wife. He also didn't summon Gamabunta all the way across the village and then teleport to him, since the summoning jutsu databook file says the summoning appears at the hand of the user, and even the bring down the house jutsu requires the user to jump above the target first, so Minato must have ran across the village, jumped into the air, waved hand signs for summoning, and dropped Gamabunta on Kurama's head, all before Kurama could even finish doing what he was doing. However, since we can't confirm that Kurama was paying attention to him here, and we don't know how long it takes for him to charge his Bijou Bomb, we can't really scale this. All in all, I think it's clear that Minato does have the better arguments, at least in terms of speed, but it's a weird debate because you really have to get granular with your arguments, and it's easy to wrap around your opponent's arguments if they don't come armed and ready. But in my opinion, I do think the Kurama argument is really solid, and if you can establish that he is above Kurama, who should be above Madara in terms of physical combat speed, then you kind of just get him above any assertion that you have for Tobirama. But thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and until next time, have an awesome day.